This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, J.J. Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's J.J. Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 389 of the Late Round Podcast, with many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. It's another regression week. Last week, we looked at teams who might be in store for some regression this year, and today, I'm going to look at things on the player level. But not just any and all players. We know guys like Aaron Jones and A.J. Brown are bound to regress in some way this year. Rather than bringing up those types of names, I thought it might be more helpful to give you guys some lower key players who might regress. Some players who you might not be thinking about when talking 2019 to 2020 regression. Before getting to those players, I wanted to send another reminder about FanDuel's $200,000 Saturday UFC Super Octagon. For just $8.88, enter FanDuel's $200,000 Saturday UFC Super Octagon and compete for your share of the $200,000 prize pool, including a $50,000 first place prize. For more details, visit FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app today. Eligibility restrictions apply. To kick things off today, I want to talk about Jared Goff. I mentioned Goff on a mailbag episode over the last month and how regression is in his favor entering the year, but I wanted to dig in a little bit more on Goff. So first off, the Rams did score touchdowns last year in a way that didn't exactly favor Goff. They had a 1.10 pass-to-rush touchdown ratio, which was the second lowest in the league. And it's a number that's far below not just last year's average, but the average that we've seen over the last decade across the league. Generally speaking, we see teams with that low of a ratio bounce back the following year. And considering McVay's Rams have had a ratio well above that mark during his two other seasons as head coach, it's not hard to see why natural regression at that level is going to help Jared Goff. But you can look at Goff's numbers too. Yards to touchdowns isn't the best way to judge touchdown regression necessarily, but it can help. It can help us wrap our heads around regression. Last year, Goff threw a touchdown for every 211 passing yards. The league average was a touchdown pass for every 162 yards. And Goff, during his two other seasons with McVay, had thrown a touchdown on every 136 yards and 147 yards. So yeah, maybe some regression was heading Goff's way in the other direction entering last year. But regression doesn't mean an overcorrection. He still was throwing touchdowns at a way different rate last year. That shows up in touchdown rate too. If you want a super easy way to spot touchdown regression at quarterback, just look at touchdown rate, which is just touchdowns divided by attempts. Goff's touchdown rate was at 3.5% last year. That's a well below average number. And it's a number that was more than 2 percentage points lower than his previous two seasons. This natural uptick in passing touchdowns from Jared Goff is going to help everyone in that passing offense, especially Robert Woods, who was only able to find the end zone twice through the air last year. Now, sticking with the Rams, I wanted to make note of the low target share that the entire running back group saw last season. Despite running backs being more and more involved in passing attacks through the years, Rams running backs ended up with a 10.1% target share last season. That was by far the lowest mark in the league, and actually, it was the seventh lowest mark that we've seen since 2011. If you look at the bottom 20 teams within running back target share over this time, so since 2011, and if you look at the teams with next season data, so that removes last season's Rams, all but 3 of those teams saw an increase in running back target share the following season, with there being an average increase of about 5%. I wouldn't expect the Rams to throw to their running backs at the same rate this year that they did last year. And that should make you feel a little bit better about Cam Akers and Darrell Henderson, especially if you were looking at projections that are largely based off of 2019 without any regression baked in. Devin Singletary is in such a weird spot this year. I've mentioned this on the show in the past that I sort of went from Devin Singletary is an overrated prospect to, man, Devin Singletary was great last year and I was wrong about him as a player. And now I'm sort of at, okay, his ADP doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. I've been all over the place. He'll need to be used more at the goal line this year if he pays off, in my opinion. But I'm not sure that happens because Zach Moss is coming into town. But the reason I'm bringing Singletary up on today's show is because he was really, really efficient last year. And we shouldn't just expect that efficiency to continue into 2020. Last season, Singletary had 7 20-plus yard runs. Only 7 running backs had more. When you give that some context, you can see regression is likely to hit because he ran for 20 or more yards on 4.64% of his carries. which among 100-plus attempt rushers, that was the highest rate in the league. Now, to be fair, we've seen numbers that high in the past. We've had 29 running back seasons with a 20-plus yard run rate as high as Singletary's last year, while the running back had a minimum of 100 carries. The problem is, among those running backs, we only have 2 duplicate names, meaning this isn't some easy rate to hit year over year for a running back. And you can see this play out in a simple statistic like yards per carry too. Singletary, because of his big runs, he also had a high yards per carry rate, or at least that was part of the reason. Now get this, 49 running backs have had 100 or more carries and a yards per carry rate above 5 in a single season since 2011. So 49 running back seasons. That means we get about 5 or 6 of them per season, and last year we happened to get 8 of them. So good job 2019 running backs. But of those 49 seasons, we have 41 with next season data. And of those 41, only 3 running backs were able to increase their yards per carry year over year. One was CJ Spiller from 2011 to 2012, one was Jamal Charles, and one was actually Gus Edwards from 2018 to 2019. And then of those 41, only 5 of them were able to maintain a yards per carry rate at or above 5. So to put this all another way, guys, it's really, really hard to maintain super high efficiency at running back. If something goes your way one year, it's not likely to be as clean and nice the next year. So with Singletary's long runs, they're going to be tough to maintain. His yards per carry rate, tough to maintain. It's a big reason we should be buying into volume over efficiency. If you think Singletary walks into more volume this year than last year, then sure, snag him. But if you're like me and you're afraid of Zach Moss playing that Frank Gore role and stealing goal line looks from Singletary, this is just another reason to avoid Singletary this year because of his lack of ceiling. Now, Devin Singletary has a new teammate this year in Stephon Diggs, and he's been a little bit polarizing in the fantasy community. During the month of June over on bestball10s.com, Diggs has a wide receiver 26 price tag. Some see that as way too cheap given the talent that Diggs brings onto the football field, but others see that as too costly considering he's changing teams, there's a good amount of competition in the Bills' offense, and the Bills are likely to be a run-heavy team. Now, that's exactly where I have Diggs in my projections. He's wide receiver 26 in my projections. So I don't have a strong take in either direction. What I do know is that for people using last year's numbers to justify Diggs this year, you're probably doing it wrong. Diggs had an outlier season in 2019, and I don't think a lot of people realize it. We all talk about A.J. Brown's crazy yards per target rate, especially as a rookie, but Diggs had a yards per target rate that was second highest among receivers with 50 or more targets last year. It was 12.14. That's only the 7th time since 2011 that we've seen a wide receiver with a yards per target rate north of 12 while seeing at least 50 targets. That alone tells you that Diggs is likely not going to repeat that performance. But then on top of all that, you can just look at Diggs' career itself to see why he's probably not going to match that number. He's now played 5 years in the league. Let me read you his yards per target rates during his first 4 years. 8.57, 8.06, 8.94, and a not-so-nice 6.90. And then last year happened where that number jumped to 12.14. What's wild is that Diggs had 55 fewer targets last year compared to 2018, but he ended up with 109 more yards. That's how bonkers his efficiency was. He's not doing that again this year. You should bet on that. And if that's the reason that you move off of him in fantasy drafts, that's fine. It's baked into my projections, and he still comes out as a wide receiver 3. But I wouldn't be drafting him in the top 20 this year at the position, even though he's a really, really good wide receiver. There's reason to be worried about Nick Chubb this year, and it has to do with Kareem Hunt. When Kareem Hunt came back and he was inserted into the Browns lineup last year, we saw Chubb's target share per game average go from 11.8% to 6.8%. We saw his PPR points per game average go from almost 19 to 13. Kareem Hunt matters to Nick Chubb's upside. What goes a little unnoticed with Nick Chubb, though, is that things should have been better for him last year statistically. First off, according to ESPN Mike Clay's opportunity-adjusted fantasy points metric, Chubb should have had 9 more points last year than he actually had. All the while, when looking at where Chubb was receiving carries, how many yards he had, and how many touchdowns he actually scored, he should have also scored more touchdowns. I've got a weighted metric that looks at how many touchdowns a player should have scored versus how many they actually did score. And based on it, Chubb should have had 2.5 more touchdowns last year. Only 4 running backs fared worse. I don't want this to be taken as me telling you to draft Nick Chubb. I think his price is where it should be. But it's also important to not just say Kareem Hunt is there and everything is really, really bad. Because there's at least something positive about Chubb's profile as we enter the 2020 season. Drew Brees was better than you probably realized last year. I mean, maybe not. Maybe you realize that he was good, but he was really freaking good. He came back from his injury in week 8. From week 8 through week 16, so relevant fantasy football weeks, Drew Brees was the QB3 in fantasy football. And he was only scoring like 0.3 fewer points per game than Ryan Tannehill, who was the QB2. So we were basically looking at Lamar Jackson, a huge gap, and then Drew Brees. But he was doing some unsustainable things. Brees finished with a touchdown rate of 7.1% last year. Not only is that well above average compared to the rest of the league, but it was the highest touchdown rate of Drew Brees' career. He threw a touchdown for every 110 passing yards. That was also the best rate of his career, and it was way better than his average, which was a touchdown for every 142 passing yards. Basically, expect a slight shift in how the Saints score touchdowns. They were 4th highest in pass-to-rush touchdown ratio last year, and given all of these numbers about Drew Brees, that makes total sense. What it means for fantasy purposes is that some may be overrating this passing attack while underrating the rushing attack, or underrating Alvin Kamara. Now to this point, and the last guy that I'm going to talk about today, Jared Cook is a very volatile selection this year. I had the mailbag question last week about Jared Cook, and I promised that I would talk about him on today's show. And here we are. I think a lot of people probably see where he finished last year and where he's being drafted this year, and they say, man, Jared Cook is a huge value. He finished as the tight end 8 last season, and now he's being drafted as the tight end 11. But I think an argument can be made that he's still a little bit overvalued, especially if you're planning on taking someone like Mike Gesicki or Hayden Hurst over him. Now, I just mentioned how Drew Brees overperformed in the touchdown column last year, and that helped Jared Cook a lot. He scored 9 times when his yardage total, if you look at the yards to touchdown conversion at tight end since 2011, he should have had more than 3 fewer touchdowns last year. Meanwhile, no player scored more fantasy points than they should have at the tight end position last year than Jared Cook, according to Mike Clay's opportunity-adjusted fantasy points metric. Cook outperformed or overperformed by 39 points. And Cook had a really high yards per target rate too. He's the only 50-plus target tight end last year to finish with a yards per target rate above 10. And his 2019 season is just one of 6 tight end seasons where that threshold was hit. So there are reasons to be down on Cook strictly from a regression standpoint. But then on top of that, you've got a more competitive tight end landscape, and the Saints went out and they added Emmanuel Sanders this offseason. That's why I don't think he's severely undervalued. I think there are plenty of reasons to believe that Jared Cook is more of a tight end 2 than a tight end 1. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. I'll talk to you later in the week with the mailbag episode.